This session is called SEO for Dynamic Content. And in this session, you're going to be learning how to set up any website that is based on dynamic content to be search engine optimized. So before we begin, let's talk a little bit about what we mean by dynamic content. So dynamic content is any web page or site that is typically driven by a database. And an e-commerce site is probably the most common example of this. And a database-driven web page will normally have on-page content that changes based on the user's action. For example, when a user searches for something on a site, based on that search, any number of products or options may be displayed. And over time, as products are added or removed, the page may look a little bit different. So that page is going to be dynamic based on the user's action, such as searching. It'll be dynamically generated to show the user what the user is asking for. So because of this nature of dynamic content, showing different content based on search queries and URL parameters, you have a unique challenge when doing search engine optimization. There's both the problem of Google finding and indexing this content, as well as not ending up with thousands of duplicate pages that Google doesn't know what to do with. So in this session, we're going to cover a couple of key things that you can do to make your dynamic content easy to index and rank in Google searches. So one of the first things that you're going to want to do is use URL rewriting to make your URLs more search engine friendly. So the example that I have on your screen right now is the example of an e-commerce site that is using URL parameters to display dynamic content. And in this case, we're using shoes as an example. So let's say, for example, it's domain.com/?, and then the URL parameters are the category, which is shoes, the color, which is red, and the size, which is 8. So using a URL rewriting technique, you can actually rewrite this URL so that to Google and to the users, it will look a lot more friendly like the one beneath it. domain.com/shoes/red/size-8. So obviously that is a much easier to read URL and it's a lot cleaner. So now depending on what type of web server you're running on, you're going to have to use a different tool to rewrite your URLs. But the most popular and the easiest to use is on Apache, you can use mod rewrite. And that's a little outside of the scope to go into mod rewrite right now, but using mod rewrite is something that your web developer will be able to do to rewrite the URLs from something that looks like the first one to something that looks like the second one. And that's one of the first things you'll want to do to make your dynamic website more search engine friendly. So the next thing that you'll want to do is to use that dynamic content to create a usable page title. So based on the search, it's fairly easy to make a title that is descriptive and useful both to search engines and users. And using the same example here of domain.com/shoes-red-size-8, a good rule of thumb is to actually use a reverse URL order. So you're going to be going from kind of specific to broad as you read from left to right, and it's in opposite order of the URL. So a good page title for this page would be size 8 red shoes, and then you can tack on from your shoe site. This is a very descriptive page title that is based on the dynamic content. It's based on the user's search, but it's something that can be indexed. And if someone was to see this, they would know what they're going to see on that page. And that's what we want. We want them to be descriptive and very useful, both for search engines and for users. So now that you have your friendly URL and your page title, the next step that you're going to want to do is add the canonical tag to the page. Now, we've covered a little bit about the canonical tag in some other videos when we're talking about duplicate content, and that's exactly why we want to use it here. We want to make sure that we don't have any duplicate content issues. So this tag is going to tell Google and other search engines that this is the definitive URL. This is the one that you want to crawl, index, and rank in your search results. So adding this rel canonical tag is definitely something you're going to want to do to make sure that you avoid dealing with any sort of duplicate content issues that may arise because your content is dynamic. So because this dynamic content is exactly that, and it is dynamic, typically a user is the one that's typing something in and having the content be dynamically generated based on what they asked for. So the next thing to do is to take that and put it in your sitemap. Since Google's not going to be able to interact with your site the same way a user does, you're going to need to take these URLs and add them to your sitemap.xml, which you learned about in some other videos. Put it in there. That way Google can crawl the sitemap and find that content without having to do a search, because Googlebot is not going to be able to do a search like that. So you're going to want to make sure to take all your important dynamic URLs and add them to your sitemap. Now, without this step, it is highly likely that Google will never find or see this page. And of course, this means you'll never get it indexed and it'll never show up in Google results. So you can imagine just how important it is to take this step and do it, because otherwise they're never going to see this content. So be sure to have your URLs in your sitemap. So the next step is to exclude non-content related URL parameters. So we know we have a lot of URL parameters that are really important. They're what's used to dynamically generate the content. And we've rewritten those to look like a clean URL, and that works fantastic. Well, there's going to be some other parameters that you're not going to want to write into the URL because they're not the parameters that are driving the content on the page. This could be something like a session ID, or more commonly, it could be a campaign tag. You might have some sort of ad campaign running and you're tracking them. In the example on your screen here, I have session equals and then a number, source equals ad for, campaign equals blogs. Your marketing department might be wanting to track ads and campaigns and the effectiveness of different traffic sources. So you're going to have all these parameters that are very, very important to your team, but they're not important to Google and they're not important to the user. And the best practice is that the cleaner the URL, the better. And also, as you learned in the duplicate content video, all of these parameters can trigger duplicate content issues. So we want to make sure that these are out of there. Now, we did do the canonical tag, and that means that this step isn't entirely crucial because we are telling Google through the use of the canonical tag that the URL is domain.com/shoes/red/size8. And that's the URL, and it's going to ignore all the rest of the stuff. But Google Webmaster Tools allows you to exclude unimportant parameters, and I definitely recommend doing that because the cleaner the URL, the better, and these parameters are not important, so let's get them out of there. Now let's take a quick second here and jump over to Google Webmaster Tools, where I'll show you how you can exclude these non-content related parameters. So here's the dashboard in Google Webmaster Tools, and to get to the area where we'll be excluding these parameters, you can click Configuration and then URL Parameters. So as you can see, Google is popping a warning here because this is very, very important, and you should only use this feature if you're very certain how these parameters are working. And this is something that if you have a large dynamic site, you likely have a web developer that you're going to want to discuss this with, and you may want to call them and make sure that this is something that you're going to want to do. Assuming you are going to want to exclude these parameters because they are something used just for tracking and they have nothing to do with the content on the page, you can click this Configure URL Parameters link here. And here you can see some of the parameters that are being excluded here. And to add a parameter that you're going to want to exclude, you click Add Parameter. Now, parameters are name-value pairs, and what that means is there's a name for the parameter, and then that parameter has any number of different values. In the example that we were using, we used session equals, source equals, or campaign equals. So, for example, to use source, we use source equals ad for. That's an easy way for you to track in your analytics that you're sending traffic from that particular ad. And of course, that's a parameter that you could exclude because it has nothing to do with the content itself, and it's going to potentially create duplicate content. So what you're going to want to exclude here is just the name. You're not going to want to put source equals ad for because you have multiple different ads. In this case, you're just going to want to type in source. From there, you pull down this little drop down here and choose no, it does not affect page content. So from here, you can actually save this setting and Google will start to exclude looking at that parameter and considering different values in the parameter, different versions of a page. So once you've done this with all your various parameters, you will have nice clean URLs, and Google's not going to be counting all those different parameters as duplicate content, as we mentioned earlier. So let's jump back into the presentation and move on. So this is one that I see missed a lot. This is a really big missed opportunity here. Because you have a dynamically generated site and users are searching for content, and in our example, we used red size 8 shoes. So one of the things that you're going to want to do is keep track of your internal search. You're going to want to look at what people are typing in very often, because you're going to want to leverage these common search terms for internal and external links. Once you know if for some reason red shoes is a highly, highly popular search term on your site and a lot of people are looking for that content, that's a page that obviously you're going to want to have in your sitemap, and you're going to want to have indexed with a good page title. But also you're going to want to start building links to it. And building links to dynamic content can get difficult when you're not sure which content is important. Well, internal search is a great way to find out what content is worth linking to and really worth boosting to get high Google rankings. So look at your internal search data, leverage that data to find out what people are really looking for very often, and start building internal and external links. And one of the simplest ways to do this is to have a widget in the sidebar that says common searches or popular searches, something like that, where you're taking the top 10% or so of your searches and having a little widget that's related to the content that they're currently looking at that links to those pages. So when Google crawls your site, they see these links in the widget, they click them, they follow, and they find the content. And the more internal links to a page, the more important they're going to feel that page is. So leverage your own internal search data to find out which dynamically generated pages are very popular and seem very important, and use that when you're going to build links both internally and externally. Okay, so in conclusion, dynamic content can cause a lot of SEO issues. When you're dealing with duplicate content, Google not even being able to see or find these pages, things like that, you can have a lot of issues. But as you can see here, they can be easily avoided by following a pretty simple process here of cleaning up the URL, using the canonical tag and making a nice page title, getting it into your sitemap, and then taking popular searches and building links to them so Google can really see these pages. So following this process will help you easily avoid any dynamic content issues and get those pages ranking well in Google.